I want to welcome all of you into this webinar. I just want to point out a few details. One is that we have a Q&A session that we shall use to put in our questions. And also we have the chat. We can also put our comments on the chat. And then we are going to address those questions at the end of the webinar. It is my pleasure now to invite our moderator, to invite Evelyn Gitao. Dr. Evelyn Gitao works for APHRC, and she's going to give a few welcoming remarks as well as introduce us to introduce this webinar. So thank you very much. And after that, Marina Plessons will be our moderator. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Peter. I'm just going to share my slides. So thank you. So I'd like to thank all of you who are returning to this second part of our series of 3 webinars. We had a really successful webinar the last time where we had quite a few participants, and we had very many questions, and we hope that we'll be able to collate responses to those that were not responded to at the time and send them to you, send them back to you, as well as send and share documents that you had all requested for. Just to remind us all and to refresh you, the main focus of the webinar last week was we explored the link between gender and adolescents' health. We examined this link with a special focus on adolescents' sexual and reproductive health. And we explored the gender socialization process and the special window of opportunity of the early adolescent period and why we must take advantage of this window. So in today's webinar, we're going to learn about the history of the Global Early Adolescent Study. And we're really grateful that we get to have Professor Bloom with us here, because he's really the history of the adolescent study. So we get it from the horse's mouth, to say, if I could say so. We're also going to look at the measures that we look at in the Global Early Adolescent Study, and how we then came about with a toolkit, both for qualitative and quantitative measures. Lastly, we're going to explore the findings that were found in the study that relate to gender and their utility in research and programming. Next week, we will then finish off by learning about the participatory research with very young adolescents. And then we'll think about timelines and mapping activities as methods of engaging very young adolescents. And we will then learn about photo voice, which is a qualitative method of engaging very young adolescents. So I want to invite you to speak and listen and hopefully enjoy the history of the GEAS as well as what's going to be shared with us today. Thank you, and hope you do enjoy this webinar. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Evelyn. It is my pleasure now to welcome Marina Plessons to introduce the panelists and to take us forward. Welcome, Marina.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Evelyn. And greetings, colleagues. My name is Marina Plessons. I work with the World Health Organization's Department of Sexual and Reproductive Health and Research in Geneva, Switzerland. And it's my pleasure to join you all today as the moderator of the session. I was also tasked with giving a short recap of Webinar 1. Evelyn spoke a little bit about the objectives of Webinar 1. But to recap a little bit more detail, we started out with welcoming remarks from Anna Thorson, who manages the HRP Alliance for Research Capacity Strengthening, which is hosted by WHO. We heard a bit from Evelyn about APHRC and about the 3 webinars, just as she kindly did just now. And we heard a few opening remarks from Simplice Mbola Mbasi, who is the WHO Regional Advisor for Adolescent Health in the African region. We then had 2 panelists with a discussion moderated by Simplice. The 2 panelists were Beatrice Mena and Chandra Muli. Beatrice started and spoke to one of the objectives that Evelyn mentioned, which was understanding how gender and adolescent health relates to adolescent sexual and reproductive health specifically. Beatrice defined gender and sex. She talked about the implications of gender on both boys' and girls' health. She talked about the preliminary findings of a scoping review of studies on gender and early adolescent sexual and reproductive health in sub-Saharan Africa. And she ended with two main conclusions. First of all, that there's widespread endorsement of inequitable gender norms and beliefs with implications on adolescent sexual and reproductive health. And also that there's emerging evidence on inequitable gender norms being challenged by both boys and girls. Then Chandramouli talked about the gender socialization process and the window of opportunity of the early adolescent period. He gave a very brief introduction to the Global Early Adolescent Study, which we'll build on today in much more detail. He then talked about the 5 key findings of phase 1 of the Global Early Adolescent Study. Those are that puberty is a critical time in the life course when pre-existing gender attitudes and norms become further crystallized. Number 2, that unequal gender attitudes and norms are widespread across geographic and sociocultural settings with similarities and differences across contexts. Number 3, that societal expectations of boys and girls differ, and so do their own gender attitudes. 4, that race, ethnicity, class, and immigrant status all influence gender norms and attitudes. And 5, that peers and parents are key to shaping gender norms and attitudes. There's also some evidence that schools and teachers shape attitudes, and the evidence on the influence of media is only now emerging. He closed his presentation with 5 implications for action, those being 1, to engage with adolescents in open discussions about gender norms and attitudes that take into account their evolving cognitive capacities. 2, to stimulate critical reflection, to change attitudes and norms within peer groups. 3, to incorporate content on gender equitable norms in parenting interventions. 4, to change norms by working simultaneously at different levels of the ecological framework. And then 5, to develop school-based efforts to promote equitable gender attitudes and norms and to address gender stereotypes perpetuated by the media. As Evelyn said, we had a very rich Q&A. Some of the topics that were covered included child and social norm change, social media and social norm change, access to pornography and its effects on attitudes and norms. We, as Evelyn said, are putting together resources and responses to these various questions, and we'll be sharing those with you soon. Today's session will dive deeper into the GEAS and introduce the toolkit. Our speaker today is Professor Bob Bloom. If I gave a full of his accolades, we would spend the whole webinar doing this, but to highlight a few key ones, Bob is a professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, as well as the Education and Medicine. From 2004 to 2018, he was the chair of the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health Department of Population, Family, and Reproductive Health. Likewise, from 2007 to 2019, he was the director of the Johns Hopkins Urban Health Institute. He's also the past president of the Society for Adolescent Medicine and has served on the American Board of Pediatrics. He's edited 2 books and written over 300 journal articles, as well as numerous other book chapters and special reports. But most importantly for this webinar series, Bob is also the principal investigator of the Global Early Adolescent Study. So over to Bob to speak to us about the history of the GEAS and about the GEAS measures and its findings that relate to gender. Thanks.
Thank you, Marina, and thank you, Peter, for all of your work to organize this webinar series, and to Evelyn, to all of my colleagues, Caroline Kabir and Beatrice Mena at APHRC, where we have a long, very long history of friendship and collaboration. So it is an absolute pleasure for me to be able to share with you a bit about the Global Early Adolescent Study. Let me see if I can be successful in putting up my slides. And if I can be, I will. And if not, I will ask Peter to do it. And as it turns out, I am not able to access my desktop here. So Peter, if you have the slides that I sent, that would make life logarithmically easier. Terrific. And I will ask you kindly to advance them as we go along. So the Global Early Adolescent Study really began from a series of consultations that I had the opportunity to be part of in Geneva. Program was interested in asking the question, what are the key research issues in adolescent sexual and reproductive health for the next decade? We're at the very end of that decade, 2010, 2020 now. But the focus, the priorities that the consultation laid and to 14 years of age. Next slide, please. The reason for focusing on 10 to 14 was that age group, there was a lot more focus on childhood and a lot of focus on 15-year-olds and older. There are many reasons why there wasn't much focus. There was a prevailing belief that you cannot get questions answered by 10, 11, 12-year-olds. And you certainly cannot get questions answered about gender norms, gender attitudes, sexual and reproductive health, knowledge or behavior. They were just too young. The bottom line is that's not true. Our work showed early on that young people can answer questions. They do answer questions, and they're about as honest as adults, which isn't to say they're 100% honest, but it is to say that there is not this huge age bias. Early adolescence at times, obviously a major developmental change, and it was a time where the previous research showed that gender norms and attitudes tend to become fixed by about the age of 16 or so. Next slide, please. So the Global Early Adolescent Study aimed to understand the factors in early adolescence, and especially gender norms that shape healthy development throughout the adolescent years and beyond. So our goal was to start with 10 to 14-year-olds and then to follow a cohort across time for at least 5 years. So by the end of a 5-year period of time, we would have much more information that spanned the ages 10 through 19. Longitudinal research is also aimed to be global, and I'll share a little bit more about that. And we were also tying this work with evaluation of gender transformative interventions. And as it turns out, about half of our sites have intervention associated research work, and the other half is descriptive. But I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Next slide. So we were interested in certain key outcomes. One, what we refer to at that time is healthy sexuality, body comfort, body satisfaction, body pride, and factors associated with that. And we have a paper that'll be coming out this fall in the Journal of Adolescent Health focused on that. The second was sexual health. And here we were interested in knowledge and behaviors. And I would just make a comment here that while there was a prevailing notion among many, and certainly many donors, that you really can't ask kids questions about sexual knowledge or behavior, we became acutely aware that many young people, millions of young people, grow up in one-room houses where they, together with their parents, together with their siblings, and perhaps other generations, are living in the same room. These kids are intimately familiar with sexual behaviors from the moment that they're born, and they're fully aware of what's going on. The third area is mental health. And as our work progressed, we became increasingly aware that mental health issues are of critical importance. Here we focus on the two major mental health issues of adolescence: depression and anxiety, school retention and school completion, and then gender-based and interpersonal violence. Why gender-based and interpersonal violence? Because girls sustain more gender-based violence than do boys, but boys sustain more interpersonal violence. And so you have both of these dynamics going on. Next slide. The formative research that we undertook began in 2015. Our work really began in 2012, but we had no resources for that work, and we met a group of colleagues, including colleagues from APHRC, formed the initial group of researchers from 6 countries beginning to plan this work. Our first funding that allowed us to move forward came from USAID in 2015. And so the first 3 years were formative research years. Next slide, please. We were in 15 countries on 5 continents, and this just gives you a sense of the geography. So it ranged from Shanghai and Delhi and Hanoi in Asia, Scotland and Belgium, in Egypt and Sud. We had a number of collaborating sites in Africa, in Nairobi, Blantyre, Cape Town, Kinshasa, Ili-Ife, and Ouagadougou. We had a couple of sites that were collaborators in Latin America, Cochabamba in Bolivia and Ecuador, and then Baltimore in the United States. So it spanned 15 countries. Our focus from the beginning were on urban poor settings. So in each of the places where we were not doing national survey research, nor were we even doing city-specific survey research. We were building this project focused on the poorest kids in a number of the poorest communities in the world. Next slide, please. So one of the things that distinguished this work from a lot of other studies is that a lot of other studies begin with a group of researchers defining the issues, defining the measures, defining the questions, and then going out, finding colleagues from around the world to work together. This was not how we worked, nor is it how we continue to work. Rather, we began with going out, listening to young people. Specifically, in every single site, we, and I say we somewhat liberally, our colleagues interviewed 35 dyads. That's a mother or father or caretaker and young person pair. We wanted to understand how they thought about and talked about gender-related issues. What were the stories that young people heard? How did they know that they were no longer children and that they were becoming adolescents? What were the narratives, the stories that they were telling, and were they the same in Shanghai as in Cochabamba, or was it all context? And we heard numerous people say, why would you even bother to do this work? Because we know everything is local, everything is contextual. And that too isn't accurate. A lot is contextual, and context profoundly influences, but there are a lot of commonalities. Next slide. One of the narratives that we heard over and over and over again was the hegemonic myth that is, girls are weak, girls are vulnerable, girls are the personification of sexuality, and this particularly begins to occur with the onset of puberty. And we heard that in Egypt, you can't go out anymore. We heard in India, you have to cover up your body with the sari so people can't essentially see your sexuality. You must restrict contact with the opposite sex because it's going to ruin your reputation and it could ruin your life if you don't. Socially acceptable behaviors were stories that could be told in China, in the DRC, in Belgium, and be interchanged. Just one example. When we asked a young girl in Shanghai, when did she know that she was no longer a child? She said, one night at the dinner table, my father said to me, you can't sit like that anymore. She said, I don't understand what you mean, Father, that I can't sit like that. She said, he just looked at me and said, you know what I mean. You can't sit like that. So this young girl was smart enough not to argue with her father. But after dinner, she went to her mother and said, what did Father mean by this? How was I sitting that I can't sit like that? And her mother said, you're a young woman now. You can't cross your legs the way you did at dinner. She said, I noticed and I knew something had changed. And these stories we heard over and again. We also heard the same stories about boys. They are strong, they are independent, they are potential predators. Excuse me, but interestingly, they're not only potential predators, but they're also potential guardians and caretakers. So there's this duality of messages. And that boys are the beneficiaries of gender inequality. Let me state real clearly now, boys are not the beneficiaries of gender inequalities, no more than girls are the beneficiaries. You say, well, girls You have child marriage, and you have FGM, and you have early school leaving, and you have all of these negative things that happen to girls, which are absolutely true. But you have, from a public health perspective, a host of negative things that happen to boys as well. Boys consume substances and alcohol more than girls. They smoke tobacco in most countries more than girls. They die from interpersonal violence in adolescence more than girls. They die from injuries, vehicular injuries, etc., more than girls. And male life expectancy is shorter than women's. And is that biologic? No, it's not. It's behavioral, and it all relates to gender norms. But these myths were the stories that transcended the globe. Next slide, please. So we were faced then with both a question and a problem. If we talk about gender norms, what are we talking about, and how do you measure it? If we talk about empowerment, what are we talking about? How do you measure it? Because if you're going to do research in this area, you have to be able to come up with ways of measuring the things that you're talking about. We started by listening to young people, by hearing their voices. We were interested in understanding, is there a set of norms that regulate male and female relationships in early adolescence? And are they same or different in different parts of the world, in different cultures? How are these norms related to outcomes of adolescent health, like sexual health and mental health? Next slide. So, next slide, please. So we started, as I said, by listening to young people. We transcribed, translated all of the stories that they told from 7 countries around the world. We extracted all of the gender messages that we heard being said. And there were over 3,000 of these messages in the interviews that were done. We organized them into common codes and domains, and then items that reflected different gender attitudes. Next slide, please. Next slide. From that qualitative work, next slide, please. Thank you. From that qualitative work, we developed a series of 3 scales. One is the sexual double standard scale, and examples. Girls should keep away from boys or they're going to get in trouble. And the kinds of things, the kinds of questions that we heard. Girls will lose interest in studying if she has a boyfriend. They'll get in trouble if they have a boyfriend. Girls who have boyfriends are irresponsible. These are all statements that came from multiple young people. Similarly, we heard about boys. Boys have girlfriends to show off to their friends. Boys have girlfriends for fun more than love. Boys tell girls they love them when they don't. And so we took these themes about boys and girls and asked the question statistically, did this create a scale? And we saw that it did. For those interested, the data are on the far right side. But we developed a scale around sexual double standard from these questions. Next slide, please. So too, we developed a second scale from what we were hearing boys and girls say. And this we called GSR, or gender stereotypic roles. It's okay for a boy and girl your age to talk and spend time together. That these relationships with boys are normal. It's okay for a girl your age to be in a relationship with a boy that's more than just friends. It's normal for a girl to want a boyfriend your age. So relationships, likewise, relationships with girls. It's okay for a boy to have a lot of girlfriends. It's okay for a boy to have more than one girlfriend at a time. So from what we were hearing, we constructed a second scale that seemed to hold together across multiple sites around the world. And these we talked about as roles, gender stereotypic roles. Next slide, please. The third that we identified from this work are traits, gender stereotypic traits. And these were what I was talking about in the qualitative work. Boys should be strong. Boys should be raised tough so they can overcome any difficulty. Boys who behave like girls are considered weak. It's important for boys to show that they are tough. Toughness is a trait. Girls who are expected to be weak, differential. Girls should speak softly. Girls should be humble. Girls need parents to protect them more than boys do. These kinds of traits of strength and or humility and softness. So we developed these three scales that we have been able to use for analyzing gender norms. So when we talk about gender norms in the Global Early Adolescent Study, we are using predominantly these three scales of SDS, sexual double standard, GSR, gender stereotypic roles, and GST, gender stereotypic traits. We also developed a series of vignettes that look at boy and girl relationships. Next slide, please. So the next area that I want to touch briefly on is empowerment. We talk about empowerment as a thing. We are going to empower girls. We are going to empower women. But what do you mean by that? What is it to empower someone? And once you figure out what it means, how do you measure it? So we use the World Bank definition, which is the process of enhancing an individual or group's capacity to make effective choices. That's to make choices and then to transform those choices into desired actions and outcomes. And to operationalize or to accomplish that definition, you need two things. You need agency. That is an individual or group's ability to make purposeful choices and to act on values. That's agency. But you also need opportunity structure. So you may have all the capacity in the world. You're empowering girls to make purposeful choices. But if they don't have an opportunity structure, it'll never matter at all. So opportunity structure, institutional, social, political contexts of formal and informal rules and norms where an individual can exert agency. Next slide. So this will just show you what we're talking about. So we have agency plus opportunity is empowerment. For the Global Early Adolescent Study, we measure predominantly agency, and we measure 3 dimensions of agency that are most important in early adolescence. I would tell you we also tried to measure a 4th, and the 4th being economic agency or economic empowerment. But we ran into a huge methodologic swamp. And I could discuss this if anyone's interested during the Q&A, but we did not pursue that. But we did 3 dimensions, develop 3 dimensions. When we talk about empowerment, freedom of movement, voice, and decision-making. Can you tell me how often you're allowed to do the following without an adult present? Examples of freedom of movement. Voice. My parents ask my opinion. My friends ask my advice. I can talk to adults for help when I need it. Decision-making. How often are you able to make the following decisions on your own? What to eat when you're not at home? Who you can have as friends? Where you can see them? Things like that. Common everyday decisions that young people, 10, 11, 12, 13, are faced with. So we developed these 3 dimensions of agency as we think about empowerment in early adolescence. Next slide, please. So this is how it comes together. Embedded in this model is agency, movement, freedom of movement, voice, and decision-making. And then the opportunity structures lead to ability to act on outcomes, which is empowerment. Next, please. Next slide. Thank you. So what we saw as we look at agency, freedom of movement, voice, and decision-making, we see some very interesting things when you compare boys and girls. This is data from 3 sites, Kinshasa, Shanghai, and Cuenca in Ecuador. So when you look at freedom of movement and compare boys on the left side with girls on the right side, you see a significant difference in freedom of movement. This comes as no shock, I would anticipate, to most everyone on this webinar. But when we look at decision-making and voice, we see very little difference. So, for example, look at voice and look at boys in Cuenca, the 3rd bar. You see voice at 3.32. You jump over to voice for girls in Cuenca, and you see 3.35. You don't need to be a statistician to say, you know what? That's not much different. Look at decision-making. For Shanghai, for boys, 3.36, and decision-making for girls, 3.45. Not only isn't the difference significant, but girls are higher on decision-making than are boys. And we have seen this subsequently as well. So when we talk about empowerment, I would suggest we need to be clear what we're talking about. And often, the big gap between boys and girls is in freedom of movement. Next slide, please. We looked at the relationships also between empowerment and SRH communication. And you do see a relationship in 2 of our sites, Kinshasa and Quinca about communicating around sexual relationships, pregnancy, or contraception with others, particularly with adults. It's much less common in Shanghai, and we don't see much of a difference there. Next, please. Let's skip that in the interest of time and move on to the next slide. So the third area that I'd like to just briefly touch on is adverse child experiences. We developed a measure of adverse child experiences derived from work that was done in the United States by Folletti and Anda and colleagues at RC, Caroline Kabiru and her colleagues, and we developed a measure of adverse child experiences. Very little work had been done around ACEs, as these are known, in low and middle income countries, very little in this age group anywhere. But the data on adults was very compelling, that the more adverse you experience in childhood, the more is related to a wide range and next slide, please. Our work with ACEs is based on our pilot data, about 1,300 kids from 14 sites, looking at the prevalence of adversity of kids growing up in low-income settings and the relationships between adversity and depressive symptoms and violence perpetration. Next slide, please. So when we look at the relationship between adversity and depressive symptoms, and we have a 6-item measure of depressive symptoms, we see a strong relationship that as adversity increases, so too do depressive symptoms. So when you look at more than 3 depressive symptoms, what you see is that for both boys and girls, their association with adversity is high, much higher. The odds ratio of having 3 or more depressive symptoms goes up 1.59 for boys, 1.88 for girls. Strong relationship between adversity and depressive symptoms. Next slide. We also looked at the relationship between violence perpetration and adversity. And so too, we see a strong relationship between the two. That, there's a great amount of interest in how do you reduce violence in adolescence. Well, what we were seeing and do continue to see more and more in our data is that those who are exposed to more adversity in childhood are more likely to be violence perpetrators. Next slide. We have expanded this work recently, and those associations are very strong. So we see ACEs are high for young adolescents living in impoverished communities. We see boys consistently reporting more adverse child exposures than girls. And we have seen this now in multiple countries. And we see a strong association between ACEs and internalizing behaviors, depressive symptoms for girls, and violence perpetration for both boys and girls, but more so for boys. Next slide. One of the things we also were very fortunate to do was, if you could go back, was to work with a group of young artists to develop graphic images that we were able to use throughout the study. So let me wrap up with a few quick comments on the longitudinal phase, which began in 2017. Next slide, please. Here, the central questions are: what are the factors that relate to gender equal and unequal gender norms, and how do they vary by site? How do gender norms and perceptions of gender equality evolve over time? How do they change over time? The third is, how do gender norms and perceived gender equality at the individual level and at the population of adolescents level relate to adolescent health varied by setting? And how do interventions shift gender norms? Next slide. So those are the questions. We have intervention sites in New Orleans in the United States, in Nairobi, in Blantyre, in Indonesia, in 3 sites, and in Kinshasa. We have descriptive sites in Belgium, in Antwerp and Ghent, in Ecuador, Cape Town, South Africa, Shanghai, Santiago, Chile, and Sao Paulo, Brazil. Next slide, please. In each site, we have approximately 1,400 young adolescents. The study begins with 10 to 14-year-olds. If there are interventions, there are 2,800 young people, half who are getting the intervention, half who are not. These are predominantly poor urban geographic residents. Most of the young people are school-based, with the exception of Kinshasa, where there's a cohort of out-of-school young people. And data collection includes at least 3 rounds over 5 years, in some sites like Kinshasa, up to 5 rounds over 7 years. Next slide, please. So that is a brief reflection on some of the components in the toolkit, some of the measures, acknowledgement of my colleagues at Hopkins, Caroline Moreau, Mau Lee, Linnea Zimmerman, and Caroline Kabiru at APHRC for her work on ACEs. And finally, we have numerous colleagues to do this work. Really is a partnership and collaboration with a large number of colleagues from around the world. Back to you, Evelyn and Marina. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Bob. Fascinating presentation. I see we have 3 questions already in the Q&A box. Colleagues, please feel free to continue to submit questions that you have. We can start with these. I have some noted down as well, but it would be great to have some more in the bank. So, Bob, the first question that came in was, how do we measure women's empowerment? And I know that this came in towards the start of the presentation. I think that you did a pretty good job answering it. Is there anything else you want to add about measuring girls' or women's empowerment?
Yeah. So I would be careful because they're not the same thing. Girls and women aren't the same. Girls have, as do boys, less power than women have. What we were measuring was empowerment of young adolescents. You talk about measuring women's empowerment. I assume you're talking about adult women. And there are other dimensions of empowerment that we did not measure. Economic empowerment, that is the ability to control financial resources, is a component of women's empowerment. Political empowerment, the ability to run for office, to vote, to campaign, are other examples of women's empowerment. So there are broader dimensions for women's empowerment than there are for young adolescents. I'll stop here.
Thanks. The two next questions have some relation to each other. The second question was with respect to voice and the choice of items that were selected for that domain in the scale that was put together. To what extent does socioeconomic status place limits on voice? For example, if one is economically disadvantaged, then choice of, say, food might be limited, but is that person disempowered?
Yes. Yes. So remember what I was talking about. It is agency and opportunity. And so you might have the capacity to exercise voice, but you will not, in the context that you're talking about, be able to use it. So is that person disempowered? The answer, I think, is absolutely yes. Now, you say, well, but our intervention is about empowering people. Well, the intervention is probably more accurately about increasing voice or increasing freedom of movement or decision making. But if the context doesn't allow for that to be exercised, they are disempowered. And I think if we're going to be effective, we need to realize that strengthening agency is insufficient to achieve empowerment.
Thanks. And as a follow-up question, are the findings on voice and communication and their relationship with sexual and reproductive health published?
Yes. So if you go on to the GEAS website, which is, it's easy, www.geasstudy.org, and I'll type it in. All of the scales are accessible. All of the tools, and you, Marina, made reference earlier to the toolkit. These are all available, and they are all available free to be used, to be taken in whole or in part. And all of the publications on everything that I have been talking about are freely available as well. So the answer is yes.
Wonderful. That's, I'm sure, encouraging news to the participants. Another question that we've received are, what are the interventions that are going to be implemented in phase 2 in the intervention sites? And as a follow-up question to that, if the interventions are different in different sites, how are you going to account for that in the analysis and making sense of the findings?
Great question. So the interventions are different. So let me just answer that first. We at Hopkins are not interventionists. We do not do that kind of programming. We work with groups that do. So for example, in Kinshasa, we work with Save the Children and with the Institute for Reproductive Health at Georgetown and University of California, San Diego. They developed Growing Up Great. I'll come back to the second part of the question in a moment. In Malawi, we work with Promundo, which took work that they've done on gender norm transformation and applied it to boys and girls 10 to 14 years of age. In Indonesia, we work with Rutgers, Netherlands. They have a comprehensive sex education program. And so it is in different of our intervention sites. The interventions are different with an important caveat, and that is that the core of each of these is gender norm change. So what we're interested in from a research lens is that core, is the common elements that each of these divergent programs have, and to say, does it accomplish those changes? We're further along with our intervention impact research in Kinshasa than we are in our other sites. It probably isn't surprising that we've been a little derailed by COVID, but we are beginning to see the impacts of the intervention when we compare the intervention and control groups in Kinshasa.
Great. We're close to the end of the hour. I wanted to ask one question that might be relevant to people who might be interested in using the measures that are posted on the GEAS and the toolkit that is posted on the GEAS website. Did in the study in phase 1, well, primarily phase 2, did the toolkit or the instruments that are being used have to be modified in some of the sites, either because of requirements from ethical review committees or in response to different findings of the formative research phase? And are there any lessons that the participants should take away from that experience if they wanted to use the measures themselves?
Yeah, great questions. The measures were extensively piloted during phase 1, and they were revised 2 times based on the piloting. We first piloted it with 120 kids in each of 15 sites. We repiloted it with 75 young people, equally divided, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14-year-olds in each of 6 sites. So they were extensively piloted. What's up is what has been used. We have made some modifications based on more longitudinal data, and all of those are reflected on what's in the website. And what we would say is the argument we would make is for those doing intervention work, use measures to see and evaluate what you're doing and does it lead to change. And don't just believe that because it is good work that it should lead to change, but evaluate it. We put these tools out to say, here are examples of widely normed measures now. Are they perfect? Absolutely not. But for this age group, there's certainly the most extensive set of measures that currently exist. They're free. use them to assess what you're interested in. But be clear what you're interested in, because like we talked about empowerment, if you're interested in freedom of movement and you're looking at voice, you're not going to be measuring what your program is aimed at achieving.
Thanks, Bob. We're at the hour. There's been 3 new questions that have just been answered, and with permission, let's see if we can get any of them answered quickly. The first one is, I think, the most complicated, and it's the question, it relates to this study that the slide that you were showing differences in the decision-making outcomes among boys and girls, where those looked fairly similar actually across sites between boys and girls, versus some difference in freedom of movement. And the person asking the question makes the comment that in some ways decision-making, freedom of movement may also require decision-making power to exercise freedom of movement. So could you please try to clarify the difference as well as the intersection between those 2 items among boys and girls in your project?
Yeah. So, as I said, we saw greater differences, boy-girl differences in freedom of movement than we did in the other 2 dimensions, decision-making and voice. I strongly suspect that the reason why we see those differences, and I'll give you a concrete example, is because of the context in which kids live. Kinshasa is more violent than Shanghai. And so what you see in Kinshasa is suppression of freedom of movement, both for boys and for girls. More of a difference there as well. Some of that has not just to do with parental perceptions and their constraints on their sons and daughters. There's some of it has to do with that. Some of it has to do with the reality of the context in which they live. And so I think that context absolutely does factor in, and probably more to freedom of movement than to voice or decision making.
Okay, 2 final questions. Firstly, were persons with disability included in the study? And secondly, can you talk a bit more about how you are or may share this information with policymakers or program implementers to incorporate the lessons you're learning?
Yeah. So the answer on young people with disabilities is that we included young people who had physical disabilities, and we excluded young people with cognitive disabilities. And the reason wasn't because we wanted to. We would have much preferred to be more inclusive. But simply the complexity of doing data collection and the resources that we had were too limited. I would mention that there is another study that is in progress right now called GAGE. It's led by ODI, Overseas Development Institute out of London, a multi-country study looking at gender adolescence and its consequences, and they have a subsample of young people with disabilities. And I have not seen much published yet from that, but this work is in progress and process, and it'll be very exciting. How are we sharing this? We're sharing this work through a number of vehicles with policymakers. First of all, we hold briefings after each wave of data collection. And sadly, the most recent one in Kinshasa was done virtually, but these generally are done in person, where program people, donors, and policymakers are invited to a one-day workshop with presentations and discussion. Secondly, we make visits to ministries and have small working groups. Third, we have developed now youth engagement boards of young people, because where we really want this work to go is for them to interpret the data from their peers and to translate those data for programs, policymakers, and educators. So those are some of the strategies we're using.
Thanks. One final question came in during that response. What benefits do early or young adolescents enrolled in the study receive?
So if the question is there direct benefit? If I am a 12-year-old who is participating in this study, do I get direct benefits? The answer is no and yes. And this, I think, is a very important issue in doing any research. The no is you don't get monetary benefits. In most of the places, you get a hot meal. In most of the places, you get a small token of appreciation. But the benefit to you is that you are providing information that can be, and if we do our work well, will be used for programs and services that benefit other young people your age. And perhaps you would be a beneficiary of that as well. But that is not a promissory note. What we promise is that we will share your information, de-identified, to improve outcomes for young people in your community. And that's something that resonates with young people all over the world.
And one final question, I'm turning into a broken record, but did you find, or do you think that age in interaction with gender may be even a bigger factor in determining the gap or lack thereof in decision-making and voice? So did you find differences across ages that might even be more explanatory than gender?
We certainly find differences by age. There's no question about that. And an example is in freedom of movement. But that, the question is, does age trump gender as an important factor? I would say that that's not the important question. And I don't know if one is more salient than the other. I think what really is important is the interactions of gender, age, and social context and environments in which young people live that together either allow for empowerment because it creates opportunity structures, or it blocks them. One of the things that we are seeing out of our preliminary work in Kinshasa is that you can strengthen voice, you can strengthen decision-making, but unless the context in which kids live reinforce the use of those skills, they're not going to be much further ahead behaviorally.
Again, reiterating the importance of agency as well as opportunity structures to feed into empowerment.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you to all of our participants for staying with us 10 minutes after the hour so that we could get through these questions and answers. Thank you to Professor Bob Blum for this excellent presentation, and to Evelyn and Peter and the APHR team for this webinar. Join us on the 26th of August for our last of the 3 webinars, which will focus on participatory methods in engaging adolescents. It should be equally interesting and engaging, and we hope you can join us. Thank you so much.